It generally takes something very special to get me to want to replay a game the moment I finish it. Because of my huge backlog of games I have both on my Steam account and on my shelf, it takes something really special to catch my interest like that. Now, I'm sure anyone who's read the title of this video can figure out where I'm going with this, but Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance is one of the most replayable games I've played in a long time. Now, before I start, I've played all of the MGS games up to Peace Walker, and have recently finished Bayonetta, so just keep that in mind. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance is what happens when you take the already ridiculous world of Metal Gear and turn it up to 11. Everything from the combat to the acting to the music just defies all pretenses that this is a serious spy thriller like the previous games. Platinum Games, in conjunction with Kojima Studios, has managed to create this ridiculous spin-off while still keeping some of the core staples of the series. The cardboard box is there, the relatable enemy backstories are there, and all the likeable supporting cast are there. Even the codec manages to receive better treatment than it did in MGS4, and that was a real Metal Gear Solid game. Despite being a fairly decisive game amongst the MGS fanbase, Rising manages to capture the essence of a Metal Gear experience, while still putting on that unique Platinum flair. Unlike other games in the series, Raiden spends a comparatively little time doing any sort of sneaking in this game, though there is the opportunity to do so. Instead, the bulk of the combat consists of fighting groups of enemies using Platinum's unique trademark Spectacle Fighter system. At its core, the system uses the X button for light attacks, Y button for heavy attacks, and A being used for jumping, and right trigger being used for the ninja run. Each of these inputs can be strung together to enact devastating combos that obliterate the opposition. However, the twist is that the majority of enemies are actually relatively spongy, which encourages the player to use the game's unique mechanic, Blade Mode, to take them out more efficiently. Blade Mode allows the player to precisely aim their strikes and hack off parts of the opponent's bodies. In addition, if the player can weaken them enough, they can also cut out and consume their spinal column, which completely regenerates Raiden's HP and Blade Mode meter. This encourages the player to constantly remain in combat, as they are able to get their health back at a moment's notice. In addition, Raiden, due to having no dedicated dodge button, has a hard time actually getting out of the way of attacks. In order to compensate for this, he has the ability to parry almost any attack that's thrown at him, and I mean any attack. This system seems to be basically taken straight out of Bayonetta in one of its abilities that are unlocked in the late game if you have enough money. And the way this is done is by pressing a light attack button at the same time as pressing the left thumbstick in the direction the attack came from, which allows the player to feel skillful for doing this. The sheer spectacle that even the most mundane combat scenarios manage to achieve makes the combat system enjoyable from start to finish. Even though almost everything Raiden does is pretty ridiculous, the story still manages to lend some of his actions believability, due to his status as a cyborg ninja. Because by this point of the timeline, Raiden's basically just a brain connected to a robot body, it's quite believable that he would have the strength to do some of these things such as running down walls to suplexing Metal Gears. There's even precedent for this happening in MGS4, where Raiden single-handedly fights multiple Gecko, or stops an entire battleship in its tracks. Whether you like it or not, the stuff that happens in this game is consistent with the rest of Kojima's world, and there isn't even anything near as crazy as the Cobra unit. Where the game really manages to shine, however, is in the boss battles. Throughout the game, Raiden faces a number of bosses that challenge his moveset in a number of different ways. Each boss is relatively straightforward, but yet manages to have their own spin on combat. For instance, a later game boss, Monsoon, consistently barrages the player with attacks, forcing the player to pull off multiple consecutive parries to make it through. Each boss also attacks the player with some devastating attacks that can cause large amounts of splash damage to the player. However, if the player manages to parry at just the right time, the boss will become exposed for a devastating Blade Mode attack, which will give the player the opportunity to cut off part of the boss. Because of these factors, facing off against a boss requires the player to remain on the defensive for most of the fight, and only attack out when the moment is absolutely right. This makes each boss fairly challenging, particularly on the higher difficulties such as Revengeance, without making them too unfair. In addition to the base combat, each boss holds an impressive amount of spectacle. With the amount of craziness that happens in the fights, I just can't help but smile. I hear a lot of people talk down QTEs, and for some good reason sometimes, but Platinum seems to be able to get them right in this game. The QTEs near the end of each boss are very appropriate and crazy and over the top. Just look at this, it's complete nonsense! The way the QTEs are handled not only pushes the atmosphere up to 11, but the keys that the player has to push match up perfectly with the actions that are being done on the screen. X and Y almost always involve using Raiden's arms, while holding left trigger activates Blade Mode. Successfully hitting QTEs makes the player feel like they've actually experienced some physical exertion that Raiden himself would have to, which makes the gameplay even more satisfying. They even seem to have improved on the way that Bayonetta did this, and they have no instant fail QTEs in the middle of cutscenes. Any QTEs that do appear are generally require mashing, and don't require a single button press at the precise right time, leaving for a little bit of leeway if the player happened to put down their controller. The way that Rising manages to use music is also very effective. The overall genre is some style of rock and metal that, despite its inherent cheesiness, fits perfectly with what's on the screen. During the game, the music starts without the vocals, but still uses the tempo and instrumental sections that would be there otherwise. The fast tempo and rock timbre that are used in the tracks manage to create a very energetic and intense feeling for the player, and can vary depending on the mechanical complexity of the battle. In boss battles, as the player nears the end of the fight, the music will crescendo and the vocal track will kick in. This creates an even more intense feeling in the player and drives them on to finish the combat experience. Even if you're playing this game on Revengeance mode and dying over and over again due to the incredible amount of damage that everything deals, you still won't get tired of the music as you go on, and it will still push you to try and finish it in those last moments. The plot of the game itself is quite light, but still manages to be satisfyingly Metal Geary. The villains, while still having some relatable personalities, are also quite one-dimensional. I feel this comes due to the fact that they are mostly introduced just before their boss fight. Of the 5 human bosses in the game, only 2 really get any decent amount of screen time in their levels before their boss takes place. Because of this, the character of the bosses often only has the chance to be displayed just before, during, and after the fight. Despite this, each boss is interesting and unique from both a character, gameplay, and story standpoint. Even the designs of these bosses are pretty good. For example, just look at Mistral. Her design is very striking and still manages to get a same sort of Bayonetta-y sort of feel across. Other bosses, such as, say, Senator Armstrong, have a much different design, but still are very kind of unique and almost cartoonish in some respects, but it still manages to fit well with the rest of the game. However, despite all its positives, Metal Gear Rising does have a few downsides. One obvious one is its incredible short length, as the average playthrough only takes about 6.5 hours, and that's including cutscenes. However, this short playtime is somewhat offset by the incredible level of replayability that the game offers through New Game Plus and higher difficulty options. Normally I'll complain about high difficulties being locked behind lower ones, but I believe this encourages the player to do multiple runs and gain skill on each consecutive run. And if you really want to do Revengeance mode straight up, you can unlock it by using the good old Konami code. The fact that this game is so short is really the reason why it's so replayable. You can blast through this thing in a very short amount of time and improve yourself in each run. Every combat encounter is given a score, which encourages the player to get on that no damage S rank on every area. Because the combat is so fun and fluid, it feels like it's the player's fault when they take any amount of damage, and this, combined with the short reload times, make the player want to restart these encounters until they get it right, and not feel like they have to. The higher difficulties also vary up the enemy placement by redesigning combat encounters with the more difficult enemies, which keeps the game challenging and interesting on consecutive playthroughs. See, you don't need a Scholar of the First Sin edition to be able to change up your enemy placement, you can bake it right into the game. The amount of weapons and sidearms that Raiden has access to also encourage the player to do multiple runs in different styles, from non-lethal wooden sword runs to crazy stealth runs to over-the-top action focused on a specific sidearm. In terms of a PC version, the game runs pretty good, but there are a few flaws present. Mouse and keyboard controls are there, but they're quite clunky compared to the gamepad option. The game also doesn't support some non-16:9 resolutions and can't go higher than 1080p, and it's capped at 60 FPS. That's acceptable, but if you do have one of those higher refresh rate monitors, it could cause some problems. The game also has minimal graphics options, but it does provide the ability to mess with the amount of particles that are created by things like Blade Mode. There's also no borderless windowed option, so have fun with that, but despite all this, the game runs really smoothly on PC, and at least on my system, maintains a constant 60 FPS. The game also has a couple of other issues, such as an unwieldy camera system that will constantly try to center itself on Raiden's behind when unlocked, and can cause some enemies to be obscured from vision when locked on. The light stealth that the game offers can also be interfered by this camera system, as trying to identify enemies' locations in tight quarters will cause the camera to move in unpredictable ways. Metal Gear Rising is one of the best games I played in 2015, despite the fact that it's a few years old at this point. I would highly recommend picking it up if you enjoy fast-paced action and campy stories. Despite the Metal Gear tag, don't expect high-quality tactical espionage action, thick plot lines, or even knowledge from the previous game. Metal Gear Rising is very much its own thing, and stands alone very well. The replay value on this game is excellent and held up to me playing it through 4 times in a row. If you want a single-player action game that you just keep coming back to over the years, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance might just be for you. Now, only if there was a sequel.